Thank you all very much, and thank you for inviting us to come and present this research. I'm going to introduce all of our co-authors. In fact, there's a whole row of people here from JPMorgan, all of whom have touched this paper in some shape or form. And I'm going to do this in reverse order of seniority, starting with the person who did the most work on the paper. So I'd like Katja Chagaeva to stand up, please. She did this as her summer internship project with us last summer. She's getting a master's degree from Princeton's Benheim Finance Center and is joining our team as soon as she's liberated from the halls of academia. Livia Wu, J.O., Catherine Santiago, also co-authors sitting along in that row. But anyway, just thank you very much. And not that these don't represent the views of JPMorgan, because they do, but I feel like, anyway, thank you to the team for pulling this all together, and thank you, Katja. So. What we're going to be doing is talking about this burden of debt, and I think, as we've all heard this morning, there's a lot of statistics showing us about the increase in debt. One of the benefits of speaking in the afternoon is having had a chance to reflect a little bit on all of this so far, and one of the questions that was running through my head is the fact that this is in many ways that we can measure increasing just a reflection of the fact that baby boomers have been living a sort of adult life with consumer debt available and accessible to them. And I think, what we just heard from Ana Maria would possibly indicate that might be part of the story. It's just there, so of course people have more of it. But beyond the statistics, what we are able to do, because we work at JPMorgan Chase, is actually access a very similar data set to the data set some of you may have already been seeing in public from the JPMorgan Chase Institute, which is actually tapping into financial transactions data. We have financial relationships with many American households, and so we're able to actually get that transaction data and do a lot of really interesting work modeling that. So what we're going to do is sort of from the ground up present what we think is a meaningful set of data. I think we don't have any conclusions as of yet. What we've done is identify a lot of questions that we'd like to dig into more. So I'll be sharing that with you. So in terms of what we have available to us in the data set, we have financial relationships in some form with half of all American households, 31 million of whom we have sort of meaningful financial transactions with. 17 million, 18 million have both deposits and expenditures, and you can go on down this tree and see we've got about 5 million households that we think we can understand or estimate the bulk of their spending. So that's a very rich data set. It goes from the age of 25 all the way up to 100. I will say above 85, we've clumped them all together because that's a little less robust population set. And I will also say this is household information, right? So this is households of any number. At the moment, we have not done the work to sort of dig into more precisely break this data apart into numbers of individuals within each household, although that's on my fantasy list of things to look at. I see some nodding. So in terms of how this would reconcile back to some of the data that we can get at the national level, there are some differences, but we think broadly speaking it's indicative of certainly patterns. And just to give some insight into the differences, when you look at student loan debts, we're looking here at dollars of annual debt service. So just literally how much cash is being spent, and this is the median level. What we're looking at is student loans, for instance, all ages in blue versus the national data, which is just focusing on 20 to 30-year-olds, right? So 2030, assumption would be it's all your own. All ages, we are making the assumption that those older individuals, we would have said all of, but obviously not, thank you. Most of is paying it off for a child or a grandchild. Auto loans, again, major difference between our data set in blue and, excuse me, I flipped those two, the national data in blue and the Chase data in purple. We're looking at least used and new car payments versus just new cars on the national data. So again, that would explain a higher price typically paid. And then finally, mortgages, Chase does skew higher there. And again, our footprint of customers is much more urban than the national average in terms of where we're underwriting loans in mortgages. And that would again reflect a slightly higher house price. So sort of understand that this data is reasonably reflective, we think, of the broader population. And so here's just the picture of all of the debt service that we see by age for all households. And again, you can see on the right, in the upper right, number of households that we have in our data, and underneath that, the national household level. And it's a little bit different, right? You can see we maybe skew a little bit more into the middle-aged. And I will say also our data obviously reflects people who have bank accounts. And so the banked, again, would skew slightly wealthier than average. But we do think it's a pretty representative sample. And again, just for those of you in the back of the room, the blue at the bottom is mortgages, right? And then you've got above that student loans in green, auto loans in blue. Purple is non-Chase credit cards. Then you've got above that home equity loans, which are very small, right? That very thin line. And then last in black is the non-Chase credit card. And here we are focusing on revolving balances only, right? So this is not including people who use their card and pay it off every month. We've published a lot of other work on that spending data, which you can pull off the web or ask one of us to send to you. But this is just looking at the revolving debt payment. So clearly, this peaks in people's mid-40s. Typically, right, you'd expect them to be at the height of their earning power and possibly the height of their feeling stretched financially as they've got children at home, are paying off mortgages, and possibly dealing with elder care as well. So when we dig into that a little bit, it's interesting to see. Now, here we're just plotting, again, the median annual debt service patterns for households who have the debt type. So if you have a mortgage, you're showing up in blue. We're not including all the zeros who don't have mortgages. And so you can see, again, there does seem to be this sort of life cycle of housing debt. Your starter home, the younger people taking out mortgages are obviously buying cheaper houses. Interesting to note that that tails down at the end, and again, maybe that just reflects real estate prices rising and maybe people who are older not moving as often, not refinancing or paying those down. Beyond that, though, one of the things that we found really interesting was that the rest of these were fairly flat in terms of any sort of age-correlated lifestyle on the size of those payments. Again, credit cards, maybe a little less clear. Home equity loans, again, tapering off a little bit as you get older, again, only for people who had them. But again, everything else possibly a little flat. Again, student loans also sort of distressingly flat, which we found very interesting. So then we said, well, let's start digging into each one of these categories. And there are three pieces of information on this page. The line, again, is the dollars paid. The blue line is the number of households, which is on the right axis, and then the number in percentages, which is actually, I think, some of the most interesting information, is the percent of our sample who is in fact holding a mortgage. So for instance, at the peak there with the highest payment, or almost highest payment, 45 to 49-year-olds, 40% of the customers that are showing up in this data set of this 5 million people, 40% of these households have a mortgage. Again, seems to be broadly in line with sort of broad national statistics. Interestingly, as people age, they do pay off their mortgages, right? Or are in other kinds of housing arrangements where you've got people, in their 70s, only 20% have a mortgage. That's still higher, I think, than one might naively imagine. In their 85 plus, again, that goes up to 107% still have mortgages. So one of our big questions is, to what extent does this reflect balance sheet management at the end of a super low interest rate environment and a sophisticated group of people who understand that they can finance their house and invest the money. Interesting to see as the tax changes take hold, whether or not this shifts at all and people make different decisions, but that's one of our big questions. But what starts getting even more interesting is when you compare that to credit card revolving debt. So now we're looking at the same kind of graph, same three pieces of information. The line is the dollars that are spent. The blue is the number of households, and the percentage number is the percent. And one of the things that I found very alarming was that this was significantly higher in percentage terms than mortgage debt. And this is revolving credit card debt. So I said 20% of households, 70 to 74, had a mortgage. 42% of them are paying revolving credit card debt, and that's 22% for the 85 plus. So again, I think back to your point, really interesting sign of financial distress And I have just gotten the 5-minute warning, so I'm going to speed up a little bit to student loans here. Again, this shows much less of a life cycle in terms of the size of those payments. Again, we were assuming it's because, for the most part, these are paying off, certainly when you get to the older Americans, children and grandchildren, rather than one's own self. Again, interesting to see how much of it, in fact, was still your own debt, and that I think we would be interested in digging into some more. Line is much smoother than in fact those other things. And this is perhaps going to be new news based on everything else that we've seen before. We actually are able to get household wealth in our data. So we've got now this data cut into multiple groups, but the ones we're going to focus on now are two different segments, those with 50,000 to 100,000, and then later from $500,000 to $1 million. And so just on this first group here, again, you can see the number of households by age, again, peaking, nice bell curve there, peaking in the mid to late 50s. And you can see that debt burden really peaking in terms of dollars spent in people's 40s. And you can see that credit card debt and mortgage debt really are the two biggest drivers here. Perhaps not surprising, but also surprising to me a little bit how steeply that drops off as people get older. And again, remember, these households that are in their 70s and 80s have 50,000 to 100,000 vis-a-vis the household who's in their 30s with 50 to 100,000, right? So those are very different demographic groups underneath that. What's really interesting is looking at this much wealthier group of people, $500,000 to $1 million, noticing that they are paying more money in debt service, but only about 30 to 50% more. So in terms of sort of debt service to asset relationship, much healthier, much more able to maintain that debt service. So again, giving a little bit more color, I think, to some of the national data that we were hearing this morning, and I think maybe adding some more richness to maybe beginning to ask some better questions about what's going on inside of this data. So the reason we do all this work, the reason we care about it, is because we are using this work to inform how we are building investment products for people who are saving for retirement, helping us to understand how we should be thinking about taking risk for people, understanding what stresses people might be facing as they're trying to figure out what their cash flows will be both in and out of a retirement plan. We've been doing this kind of data work on the 401k side for about 15 years now. Catherine Santiago and I wrote a paper a long time ago on this. So we got about 20 years of data now that we're looking at on savings pattern in and out of 401k plans. Our next big initiative is to start marrying some of this up together, right? So being able to really dig into cohorted information. We can follow these people through time now. We've got data going back to 2016. So, 2012, so now we're building up 4 or 5 years, and as we build this data set out, we'll be able to actually start looking at literally what is happening with the debt decision. If you look at the lower left-hand chart, we're showing you a snapshot of different 401k contribution rates cut by salary level. Low is below $40,000, middle is 40 to 85, high is above 80. And then looking on the right, for instance, at loan usage in 401k plans, the shape of that curve is identical to the mortgage curve. And the debt service curve, what's going on in households that are tapping their 401k plans? Where is that money going? Is it going to pay off revolving debt? Is it going to help buy a house? Is it going to pay for student loan debt? As we auto-enroll people, is that pushing up revolving debt, right? We'll hopefully start being able to answer some of those questions. So we're super excited about this data. Again, I'd say it's a teaser a little bit because I don't know that we can answer questions with it yet. I think all we've done is ask a lot more questions, but it is giving us a lot of insight into what is going on at the household level, and hopefully we'll be able to come back here in a year or two and give a much richer data set and how this ties back into actual retirement savings for individuals. Thank you.